Introducing Charles Boeckman and Talmage Powell.
Well, Talmage, you know, we're kind of the last of the dying breed of pulp writers who used to write for these magazines. And I'd like to try to remember some of the publishing houses that were famous back in the 1940s. The ones that come to my mind are Street and Smith, Popular Publications, of course, they were the big ones, and Ace Publishers. Can you remember any other publishers that were putting out pulps in those days?
Well, there was one other very big one, Standard Magazines. They put out a line under the Thrilling imprint, and you may remember Leo Margulies was the big dog there.
Oh, yeah.
And there was also Trojan Magazines, Columbia Publications, and well, there might have been one or two smaller ones, and then there were a few that came and went. But I think we pretty well covered the major pulp publishers who had any durability.
Yeah. Now, Popular Publications put out, you're not pointing the camera at me, Popular Publications put out in the suspense field Detective Tales, Dime Mystery, New Detective. Was any other in the detective series there? Dime Mystery and Popular Publications?
Well, let's see. Did you mention you mentioned Dime Mystery?
Yeah, Dime Mystery.
Well, they also had Dime Detective.
Dime Detective. Yeah. I remember Detective Tales because that's where I made my first sale. Then, okay, Ace. Now, who did Ace put out? What did they?
Well, Ace had 10 Detective Aces, 10 Story Detective, a magazine called Western Trails. Don Wollheim, who now is president of Dahl Publications. They're science fiction book publishers. Don, for many years, was the editor at 10 Detective Aces and 10 Story Detective. Mm-hmm. And a woman named Ruth Dreyer edited Western Trails magazine.
Yeah, now that was Ace. Let's see, with any other, how about some of these other, FBI Detective, who put that out? I used to sell to them.
I don't recall the title specifically, but Columbia Publications put out Smashing Detective, one or two others. Let's see, over at Trojan there was Private Detective, Hollywood Detective, and at Standard Magazines there was Thrilling Detective. Thrilling was probably the top of their suspense line.
And then Street and Smith, what did they call their?
Well, Street and Smith published The Shadow and Doc Savage, and I think they had a magazine that was just called simply Detective Story.
That was it, yeah.
Yeah, and Shadow and Doc Savage, incidentally, they were Blood and Thunder magazines. Of course, everybody's familiar with The Shadow, and Doc Savage was an adventurer who had a team of assistants who were specialists in various lines, a little bit reminiscent of the Mission Impossible TV show. And Shadow and Doc Savage, strangely enough, were edited by a very petite, lovely, gracious, soft-spoken woman named Babette Rosman. You would expect a man to edit such magazines, but she did a marvelous job of editing over there for Street and Smith.
Now, the editors over at Popular Publications, of course, Mike Tilden, we all revere and remember, and then there was Al Norton, Elger Jacobson, I think it was, everybody called him Jake. Let's see, who else? Harry Widmer.
Harry Widmer was there for a while.
Yeah. And now in the Western line, Popular put out, what did they put out?
Well, don't forget Rogers Terrell.
Oh, yeah.
At Popular, because he was really he was the big dog. And when Steger, who was the publisher at Popular, decided to, he bought the title of the old Argosy when it was a pulp, and when he decided to turn it into a men's slick magazine, why, Rogers Terrell was given the chore of making a top quality slick magazine out of it.
Yeah. And then, as I was saying, the Western titles in the Popular Publications, there was, what were there? There was Ace High, was that?
I don't recall. It might have been, that might have been a popular title. Of course, one of their big ones was 15 Western Tales. Where you got 15 stories for 15 cents, can you imagine? And Big Book Western, New Western. Just off the top of my mind, to name a few of their Western magazines.
And then some of the other rangeland romance, ranch romance, thrilling ranch stories.
Right.
Were some that I used to sell to them.
Right.
And some of the other type. Well, Street and Smith had a Western.
Right. They had, in fact, they had Western Story Magazine, and then they had a story called Wild West Weekly, which came out every week. And it usually featured series characters.
Now this was during the 40s, and then the pulps faded out in the late 50s. And there were some suspense magazines that came in then. They're in a smaller book-shaped format, like Manhunt,
Right.
Pursuit,
Right.
Malcolm's.
Right.
What else was there in that line?
Well, there was a couple of magazines that a fellow named Scott edited. There was Trapped, Guilty, Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine, and of course Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine had been in digest size for years. And during that 50s era, while there were a lot of those magazines that came and went rapidly, there was Surefire Detective, Two-Fisted Detective, and such things. But among the pulps, let's don't forget now some individual titles here and there. There was a pulp called Top Notch, and there was also a pulp called Five Novels, and they used to publish 5 long novelettes in each issue and present them as novels, and they would be, for example, they'd have an adventure story, a western story, a mystery story, and so forth, and those things.
Do you remember the editors, let's see, at Princess Manhunt? Who was editing that, do you recall?
No, I believe that Bill Manners was over there for a while, and a fellow named St. John was the publisher of Manhunt. And then Hitchcock's was one of those digest-sized magazines. It started in New York, and the trade gossip says that one day they looked out at the bleak climate in the winter and the snow was falling and says, why don't we move the magazine to Florida, which they did. They moved it down to Riviera Beach. And a man named Ernie Hutter edited down there for a good long while.
Yeah, he bought a lot of stories from me. Did you ever get down to their office in Florida?
No, I never met Ernie in person.
I met him when we went on that trip through Florida in 1975. And they were still down there then. Of course, it's 2 or 3 years later that they finally folded up. Now in the confession field, I was trying to remember the editors there. I remember, of course, Rose Wynn. She was the first one I sold to in one of my better markets at Ace. She and her husband owned that magazine.
Well, they were, Rose and A.A. Wynn owned Secrets, Confidential Confessions, and then they were also Ace magazines that we've been talking about here. And then they were Ace Books. And Ace for a while put out those double books, where one book would be printed so you read the book from one direction, then you turn the book over and you read another novel from the other direction. And those double books would actually be 2 40, 50,000 worders, and they cost all of 35 cents.
Yeah. Most of the pulps came out once a month, some of them twice a month, back in their heyday.
Well, there were even a few weeklies. There was Flynn's Detective Fiction Weekly, a title that Popular later bought.
Now, let's see, the other editors I recall in the confession field was Rose Wynn, and Nana Dorrance was over at True Story at McFadden. Jean Charbel was an editor at Ace. She later followed after Rose Wynn quit editing. Jean Charbel handled some of the stuff there.
I think she is still in the business. I believe she's at McFadden now.
Let's see, now who was editing at Florence Shetty? Was she at True Confessions? I can't recall.
No, she was with one of the other publishers. There was Mary Rollins at Hillman Publications.
Yeah, I remember her.
And there was a woman named Hilda Wright. Let's see. It's a little hard to recall some of those people after all this time.
Yeah.
And yet at the moment you were dealing with them, they were the most urgent people on earth.
Well, I knew every one of them, you know, and often went out to New York and visited and had lunch with them, but the years go by and you write for other people and you kind of forget. Well, I think that's a pretty good summary of the, now how about running through some of the book titles that you've done? Can you give me a list of those offhand?
Well, yeah, I'll give you a few of them. I did a book called Smasher.
That was your first hardcover.
Right, well it was in, to date I've sold a Smasher in one form or another, I believe 16 times. Of course that includes hardcover, softcover, various foreign rights. It includes the sale, one-time sale of movie rights, and then after the option expired on that, well, we picked up television rights on the thing from Quinn Martin. And they went ahead and filmed it, but unfortunately the series was canceled and the finished product is laying somewhere in Hollywood today in Cannes. And we sold that book to, we sold it in various condensations to magazines, etc., etc. Then I did a series of 5 for pocketbooks when Herb Alexander was vice president over there. He edited these books, and they were about a private eye located in Tampa, Florida. And some of those titles were The Killer Is Mine, The Girl's Number Doesn't Answer, Stop Screaming Murder. Oh geez, can't remember my own titles. But then I did a couple for Ace, one of which was called Man Killer, and about the only book that I did that was set in western North Carolina. And then for the old Zenith outfit, long since defunct, I did some things there, and one of those titles was a book called The Girl Who Killed Things. And for Monarch, I did a couple of titles, one called The Girl from Big Pine and another called The Raper. And then I did several titles for Whitman when Bill Larson was editing there, and they were mostly for young adults and upper teenagers. And some of those titles were The Priceless Particle, The Money Explosion, The Thing in B3, that type of thing. They were just, you may recall the Whitman publications, they used to put them on racks in drugstores and discount houses and so forth.
Do you remember the number of books? Could you just 15 books, maybe 10 books? How many?
Well, more than that. I've done to date about 22.
22 books.
About 22 books.
I remember Manhunt particularly because I was in the first issue with Mickey Spillane, and the story that I did there, How to Make the Arrest, sold to Screen Gems Incorporated. They did a TV show on that. How many TV adaptations have you done, I think?
Well, so far, in one form or another, I've got about, I don't know, 12 to 15 film credits. Now that would include credit for story, credit for screenplay that on somebody else's story, credit for story and screenplay, and that type of thing.
Now, when you went out to Hollywood, you were writing the script directly for TV. You were writing TV scripts.
Well, I did various things out there. I did one Hitchcock that Bill Fay did. I did the story, Bill Fay did screenplay. Then I did another Hitchcock. A guy named John P. Ferran did the story, and I did the teleplay. Well, let's see, one that I did the whole smear was a thing called Victim 4. And I did both story and teleplay for it.
Did you find it difficult to adapt to doing the teleplay style?
Oh, no. No, television writing is much easier than prose. Because in prose, you have to create the mood. You have to make your settings vivid. You have to come through with your characterizations. You have to do it all. But whenever you're writing for television, you've got an art director to set up your settings and your background. You've got actors to express your moods and so forth. So it's a team effort, and what you really need there is, in a television play, is the basic stuff for the team and a good director.
You're mainly writing dialogue, aren't you?
Mostly dialogue.
Well, what did you just go out and look over some scripts to get the format, the idea of the format?
Well, that was one of the first basic approaches. And whenever I first went out there, the first day I was at Review Studios, they had a company relations man. He was like a PR man. And he took me all throughout the entire facility on the sound stages where they were actually shooting, all over the back lot and so forth. So that by the time we finished our tour, it was quite a lengthy tour. I was fairly well familiar with standing sets and the facilities at Review.
You know, we've talked about the titles and the publishers and everything else. See, how about some of the writers that we recall from those days? Of course, I remember Fred Gibson because he was from my area, worked for the Caller Times newspaper. I think they finally fired him. They said he was the worst reporter they ever had. But he wrote the Westerns, and then he got successful with his two books, Old Yellow and Hound Dog Man. So I remember Fred Gibson in the Westerns, and then Bob Obitz was also from my area down there. And some of the other people that I recall, I remember Robert C. Dennis, who was I always thought was a good, solid suspense writer. And I think I still see his byline or his credits on TV shows. And Ray Bradbury, of course, started out in the Pulps. Who are some of the other fellows that you can remember?
Well, of course, the two that I recall, or several of the few that I recall most vividly, were lifelong friends, such as yourself, Day Keene, Robert Turner, Gil Brewer, and various people like that.
Well, was Gil Brewer writing for the Pulps? I don't recall his...
No, I don't think Gil came along after the Pulp era. He came in whenever the paperbacks started in such a boom in the early 50s.
Well, here's one, Detective Tales. I just picked this up. This is March 1948. And I see Day Keene on the cover, and Bruno Fisher, of course, he was in a lot of them. And somebody, Don James, who was he? Did you know him?
No, I didn't know him, but I read a lot of his work. He's a very good writer.
William Camel Gauld, I used to see him a lot.
Bill Gauld is still active.
I see Talmage Powell in here. And H. Frederick Young, he was well known.
Yeah. You mentioned Bradbury. Strangely enough, I have the impression that Bradbury really started in our type of magazines, because I have some very early dime mystery magazines with Bradbury stories in them. I keep the magazines because they've got my stories in them, but they also happen to have some Bradbury stories in them. And I think that Bradbury really, when he first started, I think he aimed at that mystery suspense feel.
That's where I first saw his byline.
Right.
And even then, he had a weirder twist to his stories.
Right. He wrote some beautiful stories, but he seemed to find himself whenever he really got into science fiction.
That's right. Yeah, but his suspense stories had a kind of an offbeat science fiction touch.
Right. They were very imaginative stories.
I remember one he did for Dime Mystery, and the guy had invented some kind of coffin that would bury itself. Somehow he gets trapped in the coffin walks out in the backyard, digs its own grave, and goes down in, That's the type of thing he did. Well, I think we've pretty well summarized those days. Can you think of any other thing we could add to what we've talked about?
Well,
this about the short story era.
it was quite an era, and unfortunately, it will never be seen again because television has usurped so much short prose fiction, escapist fiction. But it was an exciting era, and if you were a writer involved in it, it was rather like being a member of a fraternity or a club, and I hated to see it die off.
You pretty well got to know a lot of the writers and editors personally.
Right.
And, it was always a young pulp writer's dream eventually to go to New York and meet the editor.
Right.
And I remember when I met Mike Tilden for the first time. And I'd only sold him 2 or 3 stories. I didn't think of all the stories he was buying. I got up there and I picked up the phone and called Popular Publications. And here I was, just a country boy up in New York for the first time. And he came on the phone. I said, Mike Tilden, I said, this is Charles Beckman. Charlie Beckman, just like you've known me all my life. He said, come on over here and talk to me.
He was a real prince.
Yeah. And he told me about, I believe it was Francis K. Allen. You remember him?
Yes.
And Mike said that Francis K. Allen sold him one story And they said the next thing he knew, I don't know, Francis Gallen was from somewhere out in the boonies, and he said the next thing he knew, Francis Gallen called him up from in New York. He grabbed his typewriter and hot-footed it up to New York, didn't have any money, but he was a writer then. He figured he better be up there. You know?
He sounded like a pulp writer.
Yeah.
One of the finest of the writers that came through the pulps was Steve Fisher.
Oh, yeah.
And in a rather reminiscent autobiographical thing that Steve did once, he said that he sold a story for $20 and promptly hitchhiked to New York to be a writer. Mm-hmm. And of course he became a great writer. And he went through Pulp, Slick, and into Hollywood, and he wrote a lot of motion pictures that were major in their era and featured big stars. So Steve certainly realized his ambition.
Well, I think that's pretty well given us a good roundup. So this is two of the last of the dying breeds signing off.